Welcome to 1988. If 1987 was the transitional year for the Famicom, shifting from its hyperactive boom to its stable middle age, 1988 is when the Famicom is settling down. The technology is in place, and we're really into the era that people think of when they think of 8-bit gaming. This year is going to bring us some games that had real-world political consequences, some beloved classics in new series, and the final big genre to debut on the Famicom. Games designed and programmed in the West become a thing on the Famicom, as those markets become a second boom for the Famicom publishers. And we're going to feel a bit of the squeeze as the Famicom's competitors become bigger. We've reached the plateau for the system, where it settles in and becomes the workhorse of the Japanese video game industry. And the end of the year in 1988 marks the halfway point of the Famicom's lifespan, though not nearly the halfway point for the games released. We've got a long year ahead of us in 1988, so let's get started. I found Family Circuit to be pretty frustrating to play. There's some pretty interesting ideas in it. There's some things that when you start the game up are fun, but it's also incredibly shallow. And on top of that, it winds up getting stretched a bit thin. That just makes those problems worse. And even though I walked away disappointed and annoyed, Family Circuit is well regarded in Japan. It even launched a small series for Namco. Family Circuit marks the return of Masanobu Endo to Namco. The designer of Xevious and Tower of Druaga really wanted to make that Gundam game, and so left the company to found his own game company called Game Studio. He's still there. In fact, they just released that Wizard report about 2 weeks ago. It's just that Game Studio has begun developing games for Namco, and we're going to see a few more of those come up soon. Obviously, there is no story to Family Circuit. There is only racing. When you start up the game, you've got a menu, and the very top option is Settings. This isn't game settings, this is how you configure the car. First you choose the car's body type and color, and then you walk through 6 different mechanical changes that affect performance. Turbo pressure, gear ratio, engine brake, handling, brakes, and tires. The better performing options are at the top, the worst performing options are at the bottom. Now I've read that the high performance options are at more risk of breaking down, but that really only affects one gameplay mode. If you select all top end parts, the car is much faster and more difficult to control due to that. But it's also necessary to use a car in that configuration to beat the higher difficulty levels. If you choose the slower parts, you could easily wind up with a car that can only win at the easiest levels. Once you've made your car, you get a password. This is solely for quickly loading in the configuration that you want. You can't save your progress in a championship series or when you're doing an endurance race, and that becomes a serious problem. The second option in the main menu lets you select any race in the game and just practice it. The third option is the Championship Series. There's 4 difficulty levels, and they determine which drivers you're facing and how many races you have to complete. At the highest difficulty level, you have to complete 16 races, a process that takes over 2 hours. When the race starts up, you have to qualify first. The controls are simple. A is accelerate, B is brake, and you hit left and right to steer. The courses you're qualifying on are all based on real-world racetracks, but they only scroll vertically, rather similar to Endo's Xevious. If you really wanted to, you can go off-road in some areas and explore. You'll just find that the whole thing loops after about 2 screens. Once you've completed a qualifying lap, it's time to race against other drivers. And here's where Family Circuit's biggest problem hits. You cannot interact with those drivers at all. They are essentially ghosts playing back previous laps. So there's no jockeying for position or cutting anyone off. It's essentially you racing against the clock. It's especially bad on longer races or when you've got a very fast car, because you just won't see anybody after you start the race. It makes the game feel bland. Most of the time, it's just you and the road. Obviously, if you run into a barrier at high speed, you'll crash, and that has a good chance of putting you out of the race permanently. On the qualifying run, you can choose to restart at the pit, though you're guaranteed a last place position in the race. If it happens during a race, you're just retired from it and get 0 points for the race. You get points based on what position you finish the race in, and the scores at the end of the season determine who wins. So crashing out in one race isn't necessarily the end. Back at the main menu, the next option is the endurance race. And here you have to complete 50 laps of a track that you select. This is the mode where pitting matters. You can run out of fuel, and there's also tire wear. Worse, your car can develop mechanical problems, and you'll have to pit to have those repaired before they cause your car to break down entirely. The problem with this mode is that some of the longer tracks take over 2 minutes to complete a lap. That is a very long time to run one race where you're not interacting with anybody. The final option from the main menu is to just pit the computer against itself. The other racers in the game are very loosely based on real-world F1 racers, similar to how Namco used real-world baseball players in the Family Stadium series and real-world tennis players in Family Tennis. I couldn't find any details if the ghosts are trying to represent their actual lap times on those real-world courses, though. With 40 tracks, there's a lot of content in Family Circuit, but having a lot of something that's effectively identical doesn't really make it better. Family Circuit really needed something more, whether it's more trade-offs in tuning the car, or more ways to interact with drivers, or even more varieties of graphics. I was bored of the same green fields by the time I reached the end of my play session. I can only imagine how bad it would be if I wanted to play the full 2-hour endurance races. The positive side of things here is that the sequels are better, and we're going to get one of them on the Famicom, though we won't see it for quite a while.